Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I appreciate everybody coming today. This is a class about what happens after you die. It's part one of two different parts, and it's primarily a lot of this material is based on a book by the same title by Douglas Jacoby. However, other people um, in the past have done extensive work into this. One is Edward Fudge, and a lot of his material is in line with this thinking. So as we dive into it today, I pray that you have an open mind and consider some of these things, because it is somewhat different from the traditional view that people either go to heaven or hell when they die, and it can be a very emotional, personal issue for people, particularly with loved ones who have passed before them. So please be sensitive if you discuss this material with friends or family, because it is a very sensitive topic for people with strong emotions. But let's get into it today. This is some of the things that we're going to be covering. You know, when you die, what happens? You know, is there really pearly gates up in heaven that Peter's going to be there, or some other church figure from the past? Is that what happens? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? You know, sometimes we read about that with near-death experiences, and people see things and they come back and vividly remember details. Are we going to have wings? We just sprout up to heaven, joining the angels? Is that what's going to happen? You know, do you have consciousness when you die of seeing yourself on an operating table or in a car accident, or that's been portrayed in movies and books? Is that the way it is? You know, there's even a doctor who, you know, believes, you know, there is consciousness after death, and he gives his 7 reasons why he thinks that is. What about people we leave behind when we die? Are we able to visit them? Are we able to know what's going on in their life? That we see their day-to-day struggles and problems. Is that the reality? And can they sense our presence and those type of things? You know, what's the Bible really teach? So we're going to look into that today. We're going to be looking at it in several different ways. We're going to look at the ancient cosmology. How did the ancient world view the afterlife, and what different pieces are there? We're going to look at some definitions, because there's different words that are used in the Bible to talk about the afterlife, and we're going to look at some of those definitions. We're going to be reading a lot of different scriptures today, so you may want to take notes. There is a handout available that you can look at here in class or download, and that could be very helpful for you, so you don't have to feel like you have to write everything down. That's already been provided in the handout, but you could use it to take notes. You know, this process of what happens when we die and how is it linked with heaven and hell, and it's actually a multi-phase process that we're going to dive into and try to explain in very simple terms so that we can understand it. There are patristic writers, or what's commonly referred to as church fathers, and these are people who lived in the first few centuries, in the first centuries after Christ came to the earth, first, second, third century, and they were sometimes influenced and knew personally some of the disciples, apostles, or they knew people who knew them. And so how they view this topic can sometimes give us great insight into what was the thinking back then from the people who wrote the New Testament. and how did they view the Old Testament. So we're going to look at some of their thoughts, and we're also going to look at history. You know, you can learn a lot from history. Some of the teachings and traditions and the way we view things is heavily influenced by history. What happened in the Reformation? How did the thought of this topic change over time? And sometimes, you know, we get to a place of an opinion or a traditional view of things, and it's really influenced centuries before by people we never even met or knew. So understanding that history can also help us, you know, sort through the different things of this area in this space. Well, let's first talk about the ancient cosmology. You know, you'll see this picture here, and their particular wording that's used here. You can see the word firmament, and there's waters above the firmament, and there's the God in the heavens, and there's windows and doors to the heavens. Obviously, there's the earth, and then below the earth, there's a word called Sheol. It talks about the great deep, and a lot of this terminology, the foundations of heaven, things like that, that's taken from the King James Version. And I want to read a couple of these from the book of Genesis in chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the foundations of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. You know, you can see that in this diagram. And also in Genesis 1, verses 6 to 8, God said when he created the world, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day." Then later in verse 14, "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day and night. Let there be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. So this is how the ancient world viewed these different parts of our creation. The earth, below the earth, above the earth, and the firmament, and how does that connect with God and heaven and all of that. So it's very interesting. And when you think of Sheol, that means Hades is another term that's used for that. So who's that remind you of? You know, you go back to your Greek mythology. You know, he was the god of the underworld, the Greek god. And he had that three-headed dog, and, you know, he was, remember, he was brothers with Poseidon, who kind of owned the sea, and Zeus was his other brother, who kind of assumed, you know, the authority of the three, and he was kind of the top dog there in the mythology. But I want to read 3 scriptures that talk about how the ancient world, and this is in Paul's writings on 2 of them, and the Apostle John in Revelation. Ephesians 4, verse 7. "But to each one of us grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe." So there, you could see that Paul's talking about descending into the lower regions of the earth, that was how they viewed things. His other letter in Philippians 2, verses 9 to 11, "Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. And every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Again here Paul talks about every knee in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. Those three separate, distinct regions of our creation. That's how Paul viewed it. And even in Revelation chapter 5, the Apostle John writes in verse 3, "But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside it." So the Apostle John also viewed the creation as on earth, in heaven, and under the earth. All three parts are mentioned in these letters in the New Testament. Let's talk about some definitions, because that's going to be critical as you look at these different parts of this process. Let's look at one. The word Hades in the Old Testament, we've already mentioned that Sheol is that word. This word Sheol, it's mentioned 67 times in the Old Testament. And if you remember the Greek Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and even many of the Apocrypha documents, they translated Hades, it was translated using the word Hades in the Greek Septuagint. And it means the place of the dead, darkness, rest, and waiting. That's kind of what it's referring to. Let's look at a couple of these scriptures that talk about it. First, in the Old Testament, in 1 Samuel 28, verse 3. "Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land." So Samuel's died, and they buried him. And then you go down to verse 8. "So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. 'Consult a spirit for me,' he said, 'and bring up for me the one I name.' But the woman said to him, 'Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?' Saul swore to her by the Lord, 'As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this.' Then the woman asked, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' 'Bring up Samuel,' he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, 'Why have you deceived me? You are Saul.' The king said to her, 'Don't be afraid. What do you see?' The woman said, 'I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth.' 'What does he look like?' he asked. 'An old man wearing a robe is coming up,' she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, 'Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?' 'I am in great distress,' Saul said. 'The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do.' Samuel said, 'Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he had predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." This is an unusual encounter between Saul and this spiritist as she calls up Samuel from the dead. And you can look at this and you think, well, Samuel was dead, and yet he has consciousness. He even seems to be at rest. Because he asked Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? So that gives you a little bit of insight into what's life when we pass away. Well, let's look at another one. This is in the book of Luke in the New Testament, in chapter 10, verse 13. Jesus is speaking, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon at the judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades." So he talks about repenting or being gone down to Hades. Matthew 16 is another place where this word is used. Verse 17, Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." He talks about the gate. There is gates to Hades, and they will not overcome the kingdom. One way is looking at it is even the faithful followers of God who died before Jesus came. Let's say they've passed away and they are now waiting in Hades, similar to Samuel. What if they could still be saved? That could be one meaning that Jesus is talking about. Let's look at another definition. Gehenna. In the Greek language that means hell. And that's different than Hades. It's a different word. And so it means something different. In Matthew 5, verse 27, Jesus uses this word. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." So Jesus uses that word and talks about you will be thrown into Gehenna. This word is used 12 times in the New Testament. We're going to be looking at a couple more here in the book of Matthew. It's sometimes referred to as the Valley of Hinnom. Translated into Greek becomes Gehenna. It's a deep, narrow ravine south of Jerusalem. And at that time, it was a common practice where parents could actually sacrifice their children to the Ammonite god Molech. This was more in the Old Testament, but this was the area, this narrow ravine is where they did that. And this same narrow ravine or valley, as the New Testament started to come into being, it later served as the city dump. And there was continually burning of refuge and trash there. So it became a graphic symbol of the place of punishment for the wicked. Well, let's look at Matthew chapter 10 in verse 28. Jesus says, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell," or Gehenna. This even gives you the picture that Jesus is painting here of, our soul and our body can be destroyed. by God. And that's something that we look into in part 2 of this study, is that there is a view called the terminal view that looks at our souls are not forever, especially those in hell. And so that's something that you can look at next week in our second class. We'll talk about that. Let's look at Matthew 13. And verse 42, he uses this word again. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This blazing furnace, the way it's translated here, it's the Greek word Gehenna. It's not Hades. It's Gehenna. It's a different place. Well, there's another Greek word that's used, translated sometimes to hell, and that's Tartarus. And it's in 2 Peter chapter 2 in verse 4. This is the only time in the New Testament, this is the only place in the New Testament where this word is used. Verse 4, 2 Peter chapter 2. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, or Tartarus, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. So is Tartarus a different place than Gehenna? Well, this is the only place where it's used, and it's Peter writing, and he's talking about angels. So maybe this is a separate place than where people are sent. Maybe this is particularly for angels. We don't really have any other indication but this one passage. The fourth word here that we want to define is paradise. How that word is used. It's sometimes referred to as paradise or the garden and the tree of life. So let's read a couple of them. In Luke 23, in verse 43, with the thief on the cross, Jesus comments to him, Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. And this guy had a repentant heart. He had truly a change in his view of his life, his view of Jesus. His heart was in a good place. And Jesus talks to him, and this Greek word is different. It's not Hades, it's not Gehenna, it's paradise. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse 4, well, we'll talk about in verse 3, is Paul's writing, remembering a particular vision or dream that he had. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. So I was a different place that he was in, and it sounded like it was a good place. And it's a place where you could hear discussions going on and things being said, and so there's not silence there. It's something where there's interaction. In Revelation 2, verse 7, as he talks about the letter or the words to the church in Ephesus, in verse 7, whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Now this place, paradise, it's not talking about heaven. This is a different word that's used. A different word in a different place. Well, these are the definitions as you read the Bible, in the Old Testament and New Testament, you'll see these different definitions, and it's important to understand what they mean, the context that they're used in, so that you'll have a proper understanding. So let's look into this multi-phase process and how exactly, this is more of a big picture view as you look into this section. We're going to go step by step and piece by piece. I don't know if you know what this word is, eschatology, but it's what you're doing right now. This is the definition is the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind. So you could tell your friends and family, you get out of this class and you're just like, well, I'm really into eschatology now, and they'll look at you like you're a professor or something. So you could just tell them that's what it is, eschatology. So here's the, this first part that we had talked about before is Hades, and it's mentioned a couple different places, and we're going to talk about that. And I've got a picture here of the Grand Canyon, because in Luke 16, Jesus tells the parable about the rich man and the beggar. And when they both die, and he describes the environment that they're experiencing, he mentions that there's a great chasm between the two. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And that's in verse 26. So I thought, well, what greater picture could there be than the Grand Canyon? And there's people on one side, and there's people on the other side in Hades. So it starts when we pass away. You or a loved one, family member has died. Now what happens? Well, according to Luke 23, verse 43, with the thief on the cross, if they've lived a faithful life to God and they've followed what God says to do to be right with Him, in the scriptures, they go to paradise. And that's where the beggar went in Luke 16. He's comforted by Abraham, and that's one side of this great canyon. On the other side is Tartarus, and that's the one that we talked about where the angels go, is what Peter referred to there in 2 Peter 2, verses 4 to 9. In fact, I want to read that passage a little more, starting in verse 4. Let's read several of them here. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment, if He did not spare the ancient world when He brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if He condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if He rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. If this is so, then God knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. So one thing that you can think about in terms of Hades, there's comfort or there's torment. That's talked about clearly in Luke 16 between the rich man and the beggar. Let's look at a couple other passages here. Let's look at Jude, the book of Jude, in verse 5 and 6. Though you already know all this, I want to remind you that the Lord at one time delivered his people out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels, who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. So it talks about, people being held here in Hades. They're being held for the day of judgment. And we're going to look at that here next. Hades can be viewed as, this is like a holding place. And as you see the rest of this process, I think it'll become a little clearer how this links to heaven and hell. Let's talk about Jesus' second coming. Let's start first in John chapter 14, verse 1. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. So there is a second coming that we know about. And what's going to happen on that day? Well, Jesus is going to take us to go and to be with him. See, up until now, everybody's waiting in Hades, either on one side or the other. And we're waiting for Jesus' second coming. Let's look in chapter 5, verse 28. Jesus says, do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. So that's what happens at the second coming. A time is coming. And everyone out of Hades will come out, and there will be a judgment. And it talks about that here in Matthew chapter 25. I know we're going through these rather quickly. Hopefully you can go back and read them in more depth. Encourage you to read it in context and see if it does not teach the things that we're expressing today. Matthew 25, verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Same thing in Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in them, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So when that judgment happens, that's when people either go to heaven or they go to hell. So as you look at this overall process. When people die, they go to Hades as a holding tank. There is punishment there if you're on the wrong side of the chasm, as it talks about in 2 Peter 2. It talks about that in Luke 16. And everybody waits there until Jesus comes back. And when Jesus comes back, that second coming, there will be a judgment according to what people have done. And it says there in Revelation that Hades, they give up their dead. That's the point in time that it happens, not prior to that. So let's look at this, and there's one other part of this process, and then we'll look at the, how should we view this? The other part of the process is here in 1 Thessalonians, and we'll read that starting in chapter 4, verse 13. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. So when the second coming comes, there's going to still be people alive on the earth. And those who are right with God at that time will be caught up with those who are on the good side of the canyon, in the paradise canyon, good side in the paradise, caught up together, and will go together into heaven. Let's look at just a couple of those verses in heaven, just because it's encouraging. Matthew 25, in verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. That's exciting to think about. In verse 4 of 1 Peter 5, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. Your reward will be permanent. And that's one of the things we look at in this second class next week is part of the reward of salvation is immortality and being able to live forever in heaven with God. And that transition happens at the second coming. So let's look at it. Let's look at this whole process and just think about what's happening in these different phases. Let's go back to Hades for a moment. In the book of Jude that we read earlier, it talks about in verses 5 and 6 that the angels there are in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. So they're being held until the judgment, which happens when Jesus comes back. In 2 Peter 2, that we had read earlier, in verses 4 to 9, it talks about angels being put there in darkness to be held for judgment. Peter's in agreement with Jude. It even talks about there that Jesus descends there after he died. I think that's in 1 Peter chapter 3. Let's look there in verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit, After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. So it talks about there that Jesus went to Hades after he had died to make proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, those who died before Noah. Everyone who has died, who's lived on the earth, is in Hades. Jesus actually went there and spoke to them. And later, in chapter 4, in verse 4, they are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. So in Hades, that's where people are held until the second coming. That's where Jesus went, even after he died. Now what happens when Jesus comes back? That's when the judgment happens. Everyone will be judged on the same day. Out of the graves, they're going to be judged either to live or to be condemned, where they'll be punished. If they're being held there in Hades, they'll be punished, being held for judgment. And we already read about Revelation 20, where people give up their dead from Hades and they either go into heaven or to hell. Now, when you think about this view, if people are being held in Hades, that means no one's in heaven right now. No one's in heaven except Jesus. Let's look at a few verses that talk about that. John chapter 3, when Jesus is meeting with Nicodemus, he tells him in verse 13, and this is Jesus himself, no one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. So Jesus himself is confirming no one's gone into heaven. Now, that's not what you hear at typical funeral services. You know, they're in heaven. Well, not according to what Jesus said. John chapter 20, verse 17, Jesus again speaking says, Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and to your God." So even when Jesus was speaking to his apostles after his resurrection, he had not yet ascended up to the Father in heaven. Jesus had not gone into heaven yet. Now, when you get to Acts chapter 1, just within a couple months later, verse 9, after he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." So this is the moment where Jesus himself goes into heaven. And he's the only one there right now, apart from God and other angelic beings. In Acts chapter 2, in verse 25, David said about him, "I saw the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest in hope, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead. You will not let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the paths of life, and you will fill me with joy in your presence. Fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. You know, this is just another example. David died and was buried. He did not ascend into heaven. The last one I want to consider is 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 22. Peter writes at the end of verse 21, he's talking about baptism. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. Now, one thing to consider just about this verse, you know, it reiterates Jesus has gone into heaven. I don't think that's any question on anybody's mind. But look at the different types of beings that are with him in heaven. Angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. It doesn't say people. So it's just another verse in support of this view that everyone is in Hades, no one's in heaven, if you look at all these types of scriptures. The other thing to consider about this process is, what about our consciousness? Well, when you read the account in Luke 16 of the rich man and the beggar, the rich man was conscious. You know, Samuel was conscious too in the Old Testament example. The rich man recognized people. He recognized the beggar. So we're not blind and just completely silent. You know, one thing that makes it difficult in that parable, something to consider in Luke 16, is when they talk about the rich man and the beggar, it's said in the King James Version. In fact, I'll mention this, those different words that we looked at as definitions, Hades, Gehenna, Tartarus, in the King James Version of the Bible, it translated all three of those as hell. But in newer translations, and even in the old NIV, in 1984 version, in Luke 16, it translated that as hell. But the new NIV in 2011 translates it Hades. You know, they get it right. One other verse I wanted to read to you, as far as it's in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 14, just talks about the fact that there's consciousness in Hades. Let's read verses 9 and 10. The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you. All those who were leaders in the world, it makes them rise from their thrones. All those who were kings over the nations, they will all respond. They will say to you, you also have become weak as we are. You have become like us. And, you know, if you read the context, it's talking about Babylon. But it just mentions here that the spirits of the departed greet you. You know, so in Hades, there is consciousness. There's no indication that we have a connection to this world. You know, even the Luke 16 parable, where the rich ruler wanted to have somebody go, he wanted Abraham to go talk to his family, and because he couldn't. And so the Bible doesn't give really any indication that we have any kind of connection with people who are still alive in this world. So that's the overall process. We die, you go to Hades, and you're kept there, either in paradise or Tartarus or the other side where the rich young man, where the rich ruler was, out of Luke 16. And you stay there until the second coming. That's when judgment happens, and that's when we transition into either heaven or hell. And the way paradise and the other side are talked about, their paradise were comforted by Abraham. The other side, there is punishment, there is torment, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's not a good place to be. Then the second coming comes, and heaven and hell, those who are still alive will be also judged at the same time. So when we look at this multi-phase process, this eschatology, how did the patristic writers and the church fathers, how did they view this topic? How did they view some of this stuff? Well, let's read some of them, and keep in mind, as we read their quotes and thoughts, these are not scripture. They did not author the books of the Bible, but they were closely worked with. Some of them knew, and their views of this topic can give us really good insight as to how they processed the same teachings that we get to look at. Some of them we're going to look at is Justin Martyr. He lived about AD 160. He was a philosopher, became a Christian, and he was killed for his faith. Tertullian, a little bit later, AD 196, he was a Christian author and a lawyer who worked in North Africa. Irenaeus, not the same time frame. He was a church leader in Lyon, France. Hippolytus, he was a patristic writer, about AD 195. And then we're going to touch base very briefly on some Gnostics who were teaching different things in the 1st and 2nd century. You know, for this Hippolytus, he was the great-grandson, spiritually, of the Apostle John. And what I mean by that is John influenced, trained, mentored, discipled Polycarp. Polycarp then influenced Irenaeus, as he's one of the guys we're going to look at. And then Irenaeus influenced Hippolytus, sorry. And so, you know, there's a real connection there. He knew somebody who knew somebody who knew John, you know. So some of those teachings and their perspectives and their explanations of some of John's writings are going to have more insight and depth, and hence they may have deeper convictions than others. Well, let's look at Justin Martyr. Here's what he said. The souls of the pious remain in a better place, while those of the unjust and wicked are in a worse, waiting for the time of judgment. Okay, so if you consider our process, the multi-phase process, he talks about different places for righteous and unrighteous. You know, that's the picture of the Grand Canyon, one side or the other. He says both are waiting for the time of judgment. He says he doesn't mention anybody being in heaven. And if you're waiting for judgment, then judgment has not yet occurred. Okay, let's look at Tertullian. He said, and if we speak of paradise, the place of heavenly bliss, appointed to receive the spirits of the saints, severed from the knowledge of this world by that fiery zone as by a sort of enclosure. So paradise, he gives a little more description. It receives our spirit, not our body. It is a place of bliss, of happiness. We're conscious. In his mind, we're severed from the knowledge of the world. The saints who have passed away, they don't know what's happening on earth. And he doesn't mention anything about heaven. Okay, let's look at another one. Irenaeus. There's a verse here in Luke 6, verse 40. The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. That's a quote from Jesus. And he comments about this passage. Here's what he says. No disciple is above the master, but everyone that is perfect shall be as his master. As our master, therefore, did not at once depart, taking flight to heaven, but awaited the time of his resurrection prescribed by the Father, which had been also shown forth through Jonas, rising again after 3 days, was taken up into heaven. So ought we also to await the time of our resurrection prescribed by God. So, he makes this analogy that when Jesus died and was raised, he didn't go be with the Father immediately. He had to wait too. And as the letter in Peter says, he went back and he preached to people in Hades. And Irenaeus looks at that and says, we too, we're going to die and then we're going to wait until the right time. So that's, in agreement with the process that we're laying out. I also want to have another quote from him. There's a passage here in 2 Corinthians 12 that we had read. It talked about Paul and his experience, whether it was a dream or a vision. He was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, and he wasn't permitted to tell them. And anyway, he makes a comment about this and another aspect. He says, where then was the first man placed? In paradise, certainly. Wherefore also the elders who were disciples of the apostles tell us that those who were translated were transferred to that place. For paradise has been prepared for righteous men, such as have the Spirit, in which place also Paul the apostle, when he was caught up, heard words which were unspeakable as regard us in our present condition, and that there shall they who have been translated remain until the consummation of all things as a prelude to immortality. Now, when he talks about people being translated, that's not, the translations of the written literature being translated into one language to another. Translated refers to people who didn't go through the natural process of death where there's a decaying body. And I'm referring to Enoch in Genesis 5:24. Enoch was taken by God. And another is Elijah, 2 Kings 2 verse 11. When he was walking with his friend Elisha, there was a whirlwind and chariots of fire, and he was taken up to God. There was no body. Irenaeus is talking about, what about these two guys? What about people who were translated? Well, he's convinced, just like Paul experienced, they went to paradise, and they too are waiting. Okay, how about Hippolytus? Here's what he said. But now we must speak of Hades, in which the souls both of the righteous and the unrighteous are detained. Hades is a place in the created system, rude, a locality beneath the earth, in which the light of the world does not shine. And as the sun does not shine in this locality, there must necessarily be perpetual darkness there. Well, Hippolytus confirms this intermediate state of Hades, which is beneath the earth, and there's darkness there. That's an interesting perspective. And here's something else that he mentioned about this. This locality has been destined to be, as it were, a guardhouse for souls, at which the angels are stationed as guards, distributing temporary punishments for different characters. And in this locality, there is a certain place set apart by itself, a lake of unquenchable fire into which we suppose no one has ever yet been cast. For it is prepared against the day determined by God, in which one sentence of righteous judgment shall be justly applied to all. But the righteous shall obtain the incorruptible and unfading kingdom, who indeed are at present detained in Hades, but not in the same place with the righteous. Here he kind of reaffirms that ancient cosmology that we talked about in the beginning. Hades has two parts. He reiterates that, one for the righteous, one for the unrighteous. The unrighteous are being punished, and then he says that no one's been cast yet into the lake of fire, which is what we're saying, that doesn't happen until the day of judgment. Let's touch very briefly on the Gnostics, and that's the symbol that was often used, what their worldview was, and then how they viewed the afterlife. The Gnostics, the name for this group comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And they viewed three types of people. One type of person was an animalistic type of person, and they have no afterlife. Another was faith-based people with good deeds that God will reward in the afterlife of heaven. And then there was a third group of people. That's the Gnostics, or elite Christians. These are insiders who have the true, deeper knowledge of who they truly are, that they're trapped in this earthly life until they're freed from this life and return to the life they had before. The Gnostics believed that they had a pre-existence. Now, the downside of the Gnostics is they did not believe that God had come in the flesh, that Jesus had actually come in human flesh. And they did not believe in the resurrection because they saw the flesh as evil. Well, how did they view the afterlife? Well, they viewed it upon death, your body is discarded and your soul proceeds immediately to heaven. Now, some Gnostics denied this intermediate state. They didn't believe in that. Since they believed in increasing levels of sophistication and enlightenment, some thought that after death, only the righteous went to the intermediate place to be gradually perfected and promoted. Kind of sounds a little bit like purgatory. They also taught that Jesus went into Hades so that we would not need to go there. So they had a quite different view of the afterlife. And why this is important, because the Gnostics had some negative influences into the church at the end of the first century, and a lot of John's letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, parts of Revelation even try to address that concern. Now, here's what some of the patristic writers and church fathers thought of the Gnostics, and this will give you an idea of some of the dynamics they were fighting against back then. Justin Martyr says, "For if you have fallen in with some who are called Christians, but who do not admit this truth, and venture to blaspheme the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, who say there is no resurrection of the dead, and that their souls, when they die, are taken to heaven, do not imagine that they are Christians." Wow. That's pretty strong words, and especially if you've got people teaching things so radically different than what they felt was the foundation of their Christian faith, then you have to confront and clear the air. Irenaeus also had an opinion about them. He said, but these men are in all points inconsistent with themselves when they decide that all souls do not enter into the intermediate place, but those of the righteous only. So Irenaeus, he took them to task too. He said, they're not viewing this correctly. The last part of this class, I want to just touch base briefly on the history. To give you some clarity into how we got into the position that we're in today with a lot of the traditional views. We've already mentioned that Hades, this intermediate state that everybody goes to when they die, the understanding of what happens in Hades began to transform about 200 AD. It started to mean something a little different. And now this is part of why you have to take some of the church fathers and patristic writers into effect. They didn't all agree with each other. Here's Tertullian's thoughts. Therefore, as it has acted in each several instance, so proportionally does it suffer in Hades, being the first to taste judgment, the process of that judgment that is postponed till the last great day. Well, here he introduces the idea of suffering in Hades is proportional. It's based on what you've done in this life. Not everybody receives the same punishment. And, that is true even when you read the passage where Jesus says, some will receive few blows and some will receive many blows. It's in line with what Jesus is teaching. But he also here starts talking about a judgment process, which was kind of the beginnings of the seeds of thinking. And you'll see it here in another church father, Cyprian, who was a little bit later, about 240 AD. It is one thing, tortured by suffering for sins, to be cleansed and long purged by fire. Another to have purged all sins by suffering. It is one thing, in fine, to be in suspense till the sentence of God at the day of judgment. Another to be at once crowned by the Lord. In this case, he's talking about suffering for sins, but being purged from all sins by sufferings. He almost gets the sense of, am I going to make it? Or can I be purged from all my sins? And, that's the teaching in Catholicism about purgatory, that you can be perfected where the things that you fell short of in this life, you can actually be perfected in Hades and then be promoted and upgraded to heaven, which is kind of like a purgatory. Another church father named Origen in AD 225, he saw paradise as a classroom where you could continue to learn and advance into heaven, which is kind of this purgatory idea. And that's not the original intention. It was simply a holding place, an intermediate state. But now, after 200 AD, it's starting to become, maybe it's a little bit more than that. So in AD 381, Christianity was legalized in Rome. And so by AD 400, you've got nearly everybody in the Roman Empire had been baptized, although most of those conversions were very worldly, rather than truly repentant. So by the time you get to the 400 and 500 AD, this concept of purgatory was becoming more and more commonplace and more accepted. And part of the reason, um, from what some people have stated, from what I've read, is the reason it became more popular is now you've got all these Christians that are part of the church that didn't really repent and know they're very worldly. So how in the world can they make it to heaven? Well, there must be a second chance in Hades where they can work through all this stuff. And so they were trying to make sense of what they were experiencing, um, but it led to some wrong conclusions. And part of the conclusions was also in the King James Version was released in 1600. It translates all three of those different words, Sheol, Gehenna, and Tartarus, translated them all as hell. So that created much confusion. Now, in the Protestant Reformation in the AD 1500s, Martin Luther and John Calvin, they dismissed or they reevaluated many of the medieval doctrines. Like, for example, Catholics taught, unless you are exceptionally good, straight to heaven. If you're exceptionally good, you go straight to heaven. If you're exceptionally bad, you go straight to hell. You go to purgatory after you die. So purgatory was a place of cleansing where people would receive the punishment necessary to cleanse them of their sins. After someone who had been in purgatory and had suffered long enough, they would be released and promoted to heaven. Both Martin Luther and John Calvin tried to reclaim the intermediate state of the dead, but they were not successful. And so they succumbed to a hybrid. They rejected purgatory, but they couldn't bring about this intermediate state of the dead, so they just said, okay, everybody, we just go straight to heaven. I mean, that was the battle they were going through. So, in today's world, at death, you go straight to heaven for those who believe in purgatory. It's just it's a different view. So that kind of ends our class today. But I wanted to remind you again to be very careful and not judgmental toward those who have a modern day view. Be sensitive, especially during a time of grief and sorrow for a loved one who's recently died. Many people have not looked into this topic and looked into the history and all the scriptures that talk about it and what Jesus said. So be mindful of that as you have these discussions. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I look forward to the second week where we can talk about what happens in hell particularly, and those who go to hell. Is it the traditional view that their punishment lasts forever, or the terminal view, which means it doesn't last forever? So look forward to that class. Thank you so much.